Hi, and welcome to this presentation from the History Mostly Ancient Discussions group. This is an update on the Syrian Transitional Government. Of the 2 hours that we have, we're going to spend about half of it talking about the history leading up to the current situation, and half of it sort of addressing what's happened, in the last few months or so. All right. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our group, here are the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I and Aaron, the two people who will be doing this presentation, are not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. That said, we're going to try and give this presentation from a secular perspective, trying to be honest about the complications and difficulties of every side. We like to follow Will Wheaton's law of being respectful. Um, these are, of course, difficult topics to talk about, but hopefully we can have a high-level discussion. I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. If you want to ask your question out loud, we can do that at the end of the 2 hours when we get to the Q&A period. And what I like to say is these presentations, these classes are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you already know something, that's the 101. I'm still going to probably tell you things you didn't know. And if you don't know anything, that's great. This is a wonderful place to start. At 2 hours, we will go to the question and answer section, regardless of where we are on the slides. When I put dates below somebody, it's usually their years of service. This is going to be recorded. It's actually being live streamed right now, so you can find it on YouTube if you have to duck out. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. This is the link. And we always appreciate money to help put a roof over our head. So we will continue to provide these for free, but here's a PayPal link in case you are interested in helping us out. All right. So when we talk about Syria over the course of the last 100 years, we have a very turbulent country. And so there are a number of different trends that I'm going to point out now and that we'll see recurring throughout the presentation. The first one is that during the Cold War in the Arab world, there was a swing where different countries would take different sides in that Cold War. And you can see sort of three different colors here: blue being Western, red being Arab socialist, green being monarchist. And there are those purple countries, Syria and Iraq, which change over the course of the Arab Cold War between whether they're supporting the Arab socialist side or they're supporting the Western side. And we're going to see a lot of that conflict between sort of the West and the East in terms of the political orientation of Syria showing up throughout this time period and also into today. We're going to see also the distinctions between different parts of Syria, where you have Aleppo in the north versus Damascus in the south, which groups are educated, which groups have money, so on. We're going to talk about uh, the prison and torture system that existed in Syria, which is a huge part of the long-term repression in the country. And there is uh, a lot of long-term uh, difficulty in terms of reconciling a stable and functioning government within, especially the part of Syria prior to 1970. So, one of the things I want to draw your attention to is during the colonial period, right? Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire, and then it got carved up as part of the treaties that ended World War One. And one of those sets of treaties the uh, created the Syrian Mandate, which was under French authority. Now, the Syrian Mandate was divided by the French into six different sections, one of them being Greater Lebanon, which of course became independent as Lebanon. But one of the things that we notice is that the French divided first between Aleppo and Damascus, right? Those two different centers of the country. Aleppo being a center that was much more connected to trade, education, and mercantile development. Aleppo had, for a long period of time, been an extension of southern Turkey today, right? Because you have to remember the border between Syria and Turkey didn't exist. So Turkey and Aleppo had a very strong relationship going backwards and forwards throughout the medieval period. Trade goods would come in from Iraq through Aleppo, along which was part of the Silk Road, into the rest of Turkey. And so you have a very sort of erudite, uh, mercantile population in Aleppo. By contrast, Damascus was an area that was dominated by landlords and traditional nobility, right? So you have these sort of two centers of wealth with very different priorities, right? Aleppo's priority was almost always some sort of interaction with the Turkish north, and Damascus's alignment was almost always towards the greater Levant region, right? Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, all of these areas. I also put the crosshatches on this map to indicate roughly where in the lower left-hand side in the southwest, where the Golan Heights is, which Israel is currently occupying, and in the northeast, where you have non-Arab majorities. We're talking about Kurds and Assyrians. Now, the French had tried to divide up Syria, as I mentioned, to these six areas, but the Syrians themselves, at least as a national consciousness, reject this idea. And they reject this idea quite strongly, in what's called the Great Syrian Revolt. And the Great Syrian Revolt um, is when you have Syrians from all over the country. You can see on the map different locations that had erupted in rebellion, led by people from all different ethnic groups, right? You have Fawzi al-Kawukji, who was a Sunni Arab. You have Ibrahim Hananu, who was a Kurdish Sunni. You have Ayash al-Hajj, who was a Shiite Arab. You have Abdurrahman Shahbandar, who is a Sunni Arab but of Turkish ancestry, and Sultan al-Atrash, who is a Druze Arab. So you have all these different populations, and the French were able to repress the rebellion by shelling Damascus in October of 1925. But what's really important to take away from this is that you have all these different ethnic groups of Syria uniting under the idea that there's a single Syrian identity, a single Syrian consciousness. And so we see that sort of tension between the divide that the French tried to accentuate and also existed within internal Syrian politics between the Alepians and the Damascenes in the north and the south, but also this desire for Syrians to unite under one authority, under one government. And we're going to see this tension throughout the Syrian period, the yeah, throughout the modern period as well. And so this is when, in the 1930s, the French decided, following the Great Syrian Revolt, to try and reestablish the relationship with Syria and create the first Syrian Republic, which would have more autonomy for Syria. Syria would be led by the National Bloc. The National Bloc would be disproportionately Alepine. Uh, Hisham al-Attasi, who you can see there, is uh, is the leader of the republic, and he comes from Aleppo as well. And they drafted the Syrian flag with the four colors: black, green, white, and red, to symbolize connection with the Arab revolt and the wider Arab culture, right? Those are the four colors of Arab nationalism. And that flag represents this idea of a united Syria, of a Syria that represents all of the people of Syria. We then need to talk a little bit about Syria's ongoing relationship with Turkey. The region of Alexandretta, or which the Turkish call Hatay, is a region in the northwest of Syria, or the southern central part of Turkey. And that region had a plurality of Turks and a majority of Arabs, but those Arabs were subdivided into different groups like Alawites, Sunni Arabs, uh, Melkites, and so on. So all these populations that exist in Alexandretta with a Turkish plurality, and the Turkish government wants this position. It's a very desirable position on the Mediterranean. Uh, and with this Turkish population, Turkey believes that it has the right to govern this area. This is resoundingly opposed by every contingent within Syria as a Turkish invasion and a Turkish act of conquest. Regardless, the Syrians really don't have the power here, the French do. And the French feel that the Nazis in Europe are creating a massive threat, and and any enmity that the French can avoid that would drive another state towards the Nazis is an enmity that they don't want to cede. So Accordingly, they're willing to allow the Turks to invade this province, and you can see the Turkish invasion in the lower left-hand side. The troops just move in, the French move out, and Alexandretta becomes Turkey's Hatay province, which it remains to this day. But we can see in this movement, right, the slow attempt or partial attempt by Turkey to integrate the northern part of Syria into the Turkish world, and we're going to see more of that as we go through this timeline. So World War II happens. France surrenders to the Nazis in 1940. Vichy France becomes the official French government, and that becomes the French government of all of its external territories, including Syria. In order to liberate Syria, the British actually invade the country. So we end World War II with the British occupying the French occupation of Syria, right? Which is a really weird situation, but because the French in Syria are aligned more with the concept of retaining the empire, and the British are more in favor of dismembering the empire, it is the British who actually push the French out and allow the Syrians to declare independence. Shukri al-Quwatli declares independence on the 17th of April, 1946, and you can see celebrations, and they're using the green and the green Syrian flag, right? That symbol of Syrian unity, and that becomes the symbol of the Syrian Republic after independence. And so, as soon as Syria becomes independent, we see the split again between the Aleppines in the north and the Damascenes in the south. And we see this politically in the split of the National Bloc, where the National Party, um, which represents those landowners and landholders, is based in Damascus, and the People's Party, led by Hisham al-Attasi, dominates in Aleppo. So the National Party, right, represented by Shukri al-Quwatli, the current president, you have this sort of bifurcated approach, which means that Syria can't really focus on anything external with any strong degree, right? For one of the greatest examples, is that they try to coordinate a defense of the Palestinians against the nascent state of Israel. And the way that they decide to do this is not to send their own army. Shukri al-Quwatli was sure that the Syrian army would be too weak at this point to actually do any substantive damage against the Israelis. So what they wanted to do was create through the Arab League, an Arab League force that would effectively allow Syria to lead from behind in securing Palestinian independence. This ended up forming Jaish al-Inqadh under Fawzi al-Qawqji, which was a militia that did rather poorly in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. At the same time, the Aleppines wanted to seek to weaken the army because they saw the army as it being in the hands of Damascus, right? So you see this push and pull within the different aspects of the government. Now, there's a question here about what religious groups existed, what were the predominant religions. The ratio of religions in Syria hasn't changed much throughout the 20th century. After 2010, when the Syrian civil war broke out, these numbers have changed quite significantly. But before then, it was roughly 75% Sunni. That's mixed between Arabs and Kurds. The vast bulk of that is Sunni Arabs. You have about 10% Alawites, 10% Christians of various stripes, right? You have Greek Orthodox, you have Assyrians, um, you have Syriac Orthodox, you have a number of different Christian groups, either and Catholics as well, like Melkites and Maronites, and you have that remaining 5% or so split between Druze and Shiite minorities like Ismailis and so on. So, as we mentioned, going into the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, the Syrians were primarily on the northern front, right? That makes sense. They're on the northern side of Israel, on Israel's northeast side, Syria's southwest side. And you can see that Fawzi al-Qawqji led his Arab Liberation Army, which was swiftly defeated. Syria was knocked out of the war relatively quickly, um, even before Israel had actually declared independence. Um, Israeli forces had managed to conquer most of the northern region of Israel. Now, as you can see on the map in the center, the central region of the Galilee was actually not originally accorded to the Jewish state. It was originally accorded to the Arab state under the UN resolution. Um, but by the time that Syria was involved, that area had already been taken by the Israeli forces, or the Zionist forces, we can say at that time, because they weren't yet Israeli. And within Syria, despite there having been a very poor showing, the Syrians didn't want to sign an armistice. And in fact, of the four Arab countries that border Israel, right, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, Syria was actually the last to sign an armistice. And the only reason that Syria signed an armistice at all is that they had a coup d'etat. Now, we have controversial evidence, let's say, that the United States was supporting this coup. And the United States sent General Stephen J. Meade to meet with Hosni al-Zaim, who you can see on Zaim on the right hand side, in order to help facilitate the coup. From the American perspective, um, peace with Israel was not the primary concern, although it was a secondary concern. The primary concern was the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which, as you can see, runs through the southern part of Syria and connected uh, fuel in Saudi Arabia to the Levant, where it could be removed by tanker from Beirut. Sorry, from no, from Tyre. Um, but you can see it goes through a small part of Syria, and Shukr al-Qawatli had made it his policy to obstruct any construction of the Trans-Arabian pipeline through Syrian territory. So, with the American support, Hosni Zaim took power. He also felt that the war was a drain on Syrian resources, and a stable government would allow Syria to achieve an armistice. And so the Syrians managed to sign an armistice in 20th of July 1949, and all of the colored territories, the red, purple, and the green, were in Syrian hands as a result of this armistice. The red territory being territory that was part of mandatory Palestine, where Syrian troops were still occupying, and the green and the purple being territories that were sovereignly Syrian. But just as Azaim came into power, only a few months afterwards, Sami al-Hanawi launched a coup against Azaim, showing his bloody shirt as proof that he had killed the man. So you can see that in 1949 alone, Syria had two coups d'etat. This should give you a sense of the level of turbulence there. And because Al-Hanawi was aligned with the Alapines, and the Alapines, as we mentioned, have a better connection to Turkey, have a better connection to Iraq, right, because of the historic Silk Roads and trading. Hisham al-Attasi starts to reach out to the Iraqi leaders in order to try and create a Syrian-Iraqi unification, right? So this, and Turkey, of course, is Western aligned during this period. Iraq is Western aligned during this period. So Syria has a Western aligned perspective as well. But we have another coup d'etat, which pushes al-Attasi and out of the government and reinstates sort of a more Damascene style of organization, and that's led by al-Shishakli. So all of these attempts to unify with Iraq start being rescinded. All these sort of Western alliances start being rescinded. Al-Shishakli, while he originally asked the Americans for weapons. They didn't provide them, and so he begins to ask the Soviets, right? He's willing to sort of change his policy. He reaches out to King Talal of Jordan, who is the first Jordanian monarch without a pro-British policy, right? So we're beginning to see this sort of shift towards the eastward direction in line more with what Damascus would have as the general policy. And then in 1954, there is a rebellion led by Sultan al-Atrash and several other individuals who are angry at this sort of alignment, this increasing sort of shift away from perhaps the Alpine position, maybe from the Western position, and they want to become more democratic. So this revolt happens in 1954. Shishakli leaves, and the country becomes more democratic. So between 1954 and 1956, though, we have a rise of Arab nationalism that occurs throughout the Middle East, and Syria is not immune to that. Gamal Abdel Nasser, you can see in 1956, met with Shukri al-Quwatli, and we begin to see Damascus's investment in the Pan-Arab project. We also see the beginning of the intelligence officials becoming more and more pronounced, even in democratic Syria. And we're going to follow the career quite closely of Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj, who is the lead intelligence officer under Quwatli's second term in office, second non-consecutive term. Additionally, the Americans try to support an Iraqi conspiracy to overthrow the Syrian government, which pushes them further away from the West, right? Because Iraq at this time is a US ally under the monarchy. So we should talk a little bit about pan-Arab nationalism, right? It's this idea that all the Arabs anywhere in the world should be under one government because they are in truth one people, and that the borders that are created are a direct result of colonial. So part of the pan-Arab nationalism manifests with the Suez Crisis, right? In the Suez Crisis, we have a situation where Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. France, Britain, and Israel seek to undo this. The British and the French want to take direct ownership of the canal. Israel wants to make sure that uh, they have freedom of access. The British and the French are able to be called off by the Americans, the Israelis not, and so the Israelis invade the Sinai Peninsula and take it. But President Eisenhower of the United States forces the Israelis to withdraw under diplomatic threat. At this same time, Syrians also made small attacks against um, British and French outposts in Syria, which showed their alliance or loyalty with the movement, and it became more and more popular within Syria to see Nasser as the vanguard of this growth and development. So let's talk about a little bit about Abdelhamid al-Sarraj. So we have this individual um, who's head of the Deuxième Bureau, or the second bureau, the second office, which was the torture division within Syria. And we begin to establish large-scale torture implementation within Syria. We have purges of political parties that oppose Arab nationalism, like the SSNP. The SSNP was a Levantine nationalist party, right? They wanted to unify Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, but they didn't want to unify with Egypt. They didn't want to unify with Iraq. So these individuals were purged. You have attacks on the Trans-Arabian pipeline. You have uh, increasing numbers of prisons. During this period, a lot of you may have seen on the news um, about the prisons that have been increasingly opened in the post independence Syria. A lot of these prisons date back to this period in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and although they had been significantly expanded since that point. We should also note that the Intelligence Bureau starts to create its own secondary shadow government, and we're going to see more of that as time progresses. So, as I mentioned, uh, Syria begins to really break with the West during this period, right? You have Operation Wapen, which I encourage anybody to read up on. It is one of the most hilarious failed coups ever. Basically, the U.S. Ambassador claims that Syria is going full-blown communist and gets run off the road. Gets forced out of the country with plans to overthrow the Syrian government. The Syrians also point out that the United States is much more interested in other regional entities like Israel, like Turkey, than it is with the survival of Syria. And despite Syrians not really being communist, right, the two major constituencies are both wealthy parties, right? You have wealthy merchants in Aleppo and wealthy landowners in Damascus. So socialism or communism is not really that desirable to most Syrians in the 1950s. Despite this, the fact that Syria is resisting integration with Iraq, is resisting direct presence in US-led organizations, and is Arab nationalist increasingly, that's enough for it to be uh, cut off from the West, and therefore Syria cuts the West off in return. And this leads to the United Arab Republic period between 1958 and 1961. Basically, Syria and Egypt and North Yemen for a period unite as the United Arab Republic, which basically involves Nasser trying to control the entire government of Syria. It even leads to Nasser trying to start a revolt in Iraq to try and overturn the recent Iraqi nationalist coup d'etat towards an Arab socialist one. In both cases, effectively, Nasser failed. In Syria, he failed because he had insulted the military and he tried to expropriate the wealth of both the Aleppines and the Damascenes, which led to the Syrian army, with financial support of both the Aleppines and the Damascenes, to expel him. Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj, who was one of the few Syrians aligned with Nasser, was also he was imprisoned and then eventually expelled to Egypt. But what this showed is that while Syria could be involved in the Arab nationalist project, there would need to be some respect for Syrian autonomy. And so we'll see this push and pull as well, this tension between Syria's place as part of the Arab nationalist or Arab socialist world, right? We saw the tension with the West. We saw the tension with Turkey. We've seen the tension with Israel. We've seen the tension with the pan Arab movement. And so these things sort of wax and wane depending on which Syrian ruler is in power. And that's one of the considerations that a lot of people are bringing to this current Syrian situation of which way is Syria's alliance going to go. And then we have the aberration, right? So from 1963 until just recently, Syria has been under the control of the Ba'ath Party. In the beginning, the Ba'ath starts out as a relatively socialist party with large-scale evangelism to rural people, especially those that felt that they had been downtrodden under either Damascene landowners or under Aleppine merchant classes. In particular, this tended to focus heavily on the Alawite population. As I mentioned before, Alawites are only 10% of the Syrian population, but they are, especially in 1963, disproportionately poor. They're working as sharecroppers, in large part on lands owned by the Damascene nobility. And so it's natural for them to feel an affinity for a socialist movement that is seeking to expropriate the wealth and give it back to the people in a certain sense. Now, we should also understand that this was not a movement similar to the other coups, which were relatively bloodless. Like there would be a few leaders at the top who would die, but generally speaking, there were no wide-scale purges. That changes. Starting in 1963, we have large-scale purges. We have increasing involvement of the security apparatus, because while Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj himself is no longer involved, we have new leaders, and these leaders begin to remove politicians they disagree with, intimidate voters, kill large swaths of the population. And we begin to see a disconnect between the elected government, right? Because Syria is still a republic, still has elected officials despite all these coups, and these military individuals and the intelligence services. There are even jokes where the civilian members of the National Council of the Revolutionary Command, which is the official governing body, right, has some militants, it has some civilian rulers. The civilian rulers start noticing that decisions get made in meetings that they're not a part of. And this begins sort of a tug of war between the different members of the coalitions that had formed the National Council. In 1966, there was a coup even within the Ba'ath, which ends a lot of the socialist aspirations of the country and splits the rule between two different rulers, Saleh Jadid, who takes over the civilian wing of the government, and Hafiz al-Assad, who takes over the militant wing. Saleh Jadid is much more typically socialist or communist, according to typical understandings of that. He expropriates significant portions of land. He begins large infrastructure projects. He begins to secularize the education. And this throws Syria into a massive amount of internal turmoil as a lot of wealthy individuals resist and are then purged. In the middle of this, right, because the coup happens in 1966, 1967, while Salah al-Jadid is completely reorganizing the internal apparatus of the country, is when the Six Day War breaks out. And Israel is able to achieve a massive victory over the Syrians, taking over the Golan Heights, which is significantly elevated over the Israeli territory and gives Israel a strategic advantage inside of Syria. We then begin to see this burgeoning alliance between Israel and Jordan, which Syria sees as an issue, right? Because Jordan has gone back into the Western sphere. They have a new king, Hussein, who is more Western aligned. And Israel has now conquered some Syrian territory, right? That's the Golan Heights. And while the two countries are still at legal war with each other, Jordan understands that Israel is less of a threat than a lot of its internal Palestinian militants. But Syria understands that if those Palestinian militants take out the king, they're much more likely to be pan-Arabist and therefore more aligned with the Syrian government. So Syria actually sends their military into Jordan, and at this time, or roughly a little bit before this time, Jordan sends a communique to Israel requesting Israel not intervene if Jordan has to move its troops away from the Israeli border to deal with the Syrians. And Israel basically gives Jordan the green light. Jordan deals with the Syrians, and Jordan deals with the Palestinian uprising in what's called Black September. One of the interesting things that we see is that the Syrians again try to cosplay as Palestinians, right? We saw that Fawzi al-Quqji's um, Jaysh al-Inqadh during the 1948 war was a Syrian army led by Syrians, but that tried to recruit Palestinians during the war of the 1948 war. This invasion was led by tanks designated as the Palestinian Liberation Army. You shouldn't confuse that with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is a Palestinian entity, right? That's run by Yasser Arafat. But the Palestinian Liberation Army, the PLA, is actually a Syrian group with Syrian Palestinians. These are Palestinians who fled in 48 to Syria, got conscripted within Syria, and sent back under Syrian orders to Jordan as sort of this sort of cosplaying attempt to set up a new government in Jordan. And we'll see again that Syria sees itself as sort of this regional player, right? So we have this sort of another tension within Syria that it's a weaker state than perhaps some of its neighbors. It's weaker than Turkey. It's sometimes weaker than Iran. It's weaker than Egypt, right? Egypt managed to absorb Syria for 3 years. But at the same time, once Syria is independent, it sees itself as the biggest power in the Levant, and so it tries to organize governments there. We'll see this much more fully with Lebanon. So after um, this Syrian invasion of Jordan fails, Hafiz al-Assad brings his soldiers to the the presidential palace, arrests Saleh al-Jadid, and declares that he is going to institute the corrective movement to fix the country. And he holds a referendum on whether he should be president. The referendum is literally, is Hafiz Assad the president? Yes or no? Um, there are no alternate candidates. There is no permission to not vote. And as you can see, Hafiz al-Assad wins an astounding victory of over 99.2%, winning every province and winning every town. It is incredibly surprising. And it should follow rationally that he creates a new constitution, which empowers him more directly. And he also establishes the Ba'ath Syrian flag, right? That is the flag you can see in the picture of red on the top as opposed to green on the top, and the stars are green. Um, we also begin to see that because Hafiz al-Assad comes from the intelligence background and he runs the country from the intelligence perspective as opposed to from a civilian perspective, he creates a civilian parliament with a Sunni majority, even though he's Alawite. He creates all these different things, but the Sunni parliament doesn't really do anything in terms of actual governance. It's just there for facial value. And the discordance between a Syria that runs facially and a Syria that runs truthfully is actually produced by the Syrian media as part of its own way of creating and manufacturing its own dissent. One of these famous films is Ghurba, which came out in 1976. Um, and this particular scene is a relatively funny one. Um, I mean, the whole movie is supposed to be a comedy, but it's an absurdist comedy. And the man on the right is explaining to the people on the left that he is the emissary of the new Syrian constitution of 1973, and he wants them to agree to it, that it's a good constitution. And they ask him, "Where is the constitution?" And he says, "Well, you know, it's on the bag." And they say, okay, so where's the bag? The bag is on the donkey. Okay, so where's the donkey? The donkey's over there. What's in the donkey's mouth? Oh, look, the donkey's eating the Constitution, right? So it's that they never have to actually prove what's going on. There's always another level of intricacy or confusion. And so nobody really knows what the government is doing, only that the government is consolidating power. And the prisons that we saw before are increasingly expanding. We also see that Hafiz al-Assad begins a period that I call a caudilloization, that they are ruled by this military strongman. So Hafiz al-Assad stops being pan-Arab. He stops with the socialism of Saleh Jadid. He uses the Damascene property owners as his primary backers, and so he's much less worried about wealth inequality and all these kinds of issues because those are the people who are empowering him. And we see him slowly try to get back on good terms with the West. Now, Egypt makes that a lot quicker because they're willing to make peace with Israel. Hafiz al-Assad is not willing to make that overture because Egypt goes through the same caudilloization. The war in 1973 happens. Hafiz al-Assad, um, you know, uh, spends time with the soldiers, but they don't really win anything. But the end result of the war is that Israel and Syria declare that there is this UNDOF, the UN Disengagement Observer Force, that will sit between the Israeli occupied part of the Golan Heights and the Syrian controlled provinces of Deraa, Suwaida, um, and the outskirts of Damascus. You can see that UNDOF zone in the right side map in purple, and no Israeli forces or Syrian forces were permitted inside that area, only UN observers, and they had to be from countries that recognized both Israel and Syria. Since 1974, until the Syrian civil war, there had only been minor skirmishes across the UNDOF zone. By and large, it has been considered one of the best UN negotiated armistices in history. In order to legitimate himself, Hafez al-Assad knows that according to the Syrian constitution, that the president of the Syrian Republic has to be a Muslim. And so, since he's an Alawite, he needs to improve his Islamic bona fides because the Alawite religion is a heterodox form of Islam, if it is Islam at all. My view is that it's a post-Islamic religion, the same way that Mormonism is a post-Christian religion, but this is, of course, very contentious. Hafiz al-Assad gets support from a number of Shiite sheikhs in Syria that Alawism is a form of Shiite Islam and is not a separate religion in order to avoid this sort of negative view. And despite this, especially because he helps Christians at the beginning of the Lebanese civil war, he has a massive Islamist insurgency. And this insurgency is from all parts of Syria, especially concentrated around the cities of Hama and Homs. Hama, in particular, was bombed from the sky. It's estimated that the Islamist insurgency resulted in between 10,000 and 40,000 deaths. We don't know because quite literally, uh, the atrocities have been covered up since the Assad administration. I imagine that one of the things that we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years is that the new Syrian administration, because it's not aligned with Assad, is going to try and expand the resources devoted to studying what happened um, in putting down this revolt and in the large-scale imprisonment and torture of the leaders of the insurgency, especially since in many cases these Islamists were the antecedents of the current Islamists like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. We also see Iran linking closely with the Assads. Uh, Ayatollah Khomeini um, agreed that uh, the Alawites were a form of Shiite Islam, further buttressing their perspective. And it was helpful for Iran to have an ally as it went to war against Iraq, so it could pincer Iraq on both sides. Syria never directly intervened in the Iraq war, but the fact that the Syria was on side with Iran uh, helped to box Iraq in. Then we have Syria's involvement in Lebanon. So Syria directly involves itself in the Lebanese civil war. They send the Palestinian Liberation Army, right? That Syrian-led Palestinian officially military force. And according to the agreement um, set in October of 1976, an Arab deterrent force is made in order to try and hold back the fighting between the different Lebanese contingents. And the Syrians are the overwhelming majority. They're over 80% at the beginning, and slowly but surely the other Arab countries withdraw their forces over the next few months, meaning that Syria becomes effectively the kingmaker within Lebanon, right? So we have this Syrian involvement in Lebanon, and not only do they do this with their direct military forces and the Palestinian Liberation Army, they also try to co-opt a number of Lebanese militant groups into the Syrian fold, primarily targeting Shiite groups like the Amal movement and like Hezbollah. When the Lebanese civil wars ended with the Taifa agreement, the Syrian army maintains an occupation of the eastern half of the country and continues to operate throughout the country. So even though Lebanon is free and has democratic elections, the Syrian intelligence service begins to operate in Lebanon, making a Lebanon a manufactured democracy in much the same way that Syria was. In fact, you can see Ghazi Kanaan here. Ghazi Kanaan was the head of Syrian intelligence in Lebanon from 1989 until 2004. And he was responsible for directing Lebanon security forces. In fact, Jamila Sayed, who you can see here, who was the head of the Sûreté Générale, the general security in Lebanon, would give his reports not to the president of Lebanon in most cases, but to Ghazi Kanaan, right? And to see how audacious the Syrians were in their willingness to control Lebanese politics, you can see Ghazi Kanaan's quote here. You Lebanese, you are shrewd, creative, and successful merchants. Soon you are going to have 12 million neighbors, he's referring to the Syrians, coming towards you. Create light industries, engage in trade and commerce, indulge in light media, which does not affect security. Shine all over the world by your inventiveness and leave politics to us. Each has his domain in Lebanon. Yours is trade, ours, politics and security. And it was only with the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, who you can see at the bottom, that the Syrian position in Lebanon slowly began to be more and more undercut. You have the Assad family, the rapprochement with the United States. In fact, Syria was involved on the US side in the Persian Gulf War of 1991. We can see here further Turkish involvement in Syria during Hafez al-Assad years. Turkish involvement in Syria came through two primary lenses during this period. The first one is that there were massive projects throughout the Adana region of Turkey, where the rivers that flow into Syria, especially the Euphrates, start in Turkey and then move into Syria. And as part of this Turkish project, they were industrializing a significant part of that region and building a number of dams, which lessened water flow into Syria and caused water shortages and droughts within Syria, further inflaming relations between Syria and Turkey. Of course, Hafez al-Assad refused to recognize the seizure of Alexandretta region, which Turkey had taken in 1938, which we discussed. But the biggest overlap for them in terms of what was going on is that Hafiz al-Assad promoted the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and gave refuge to its leader, Abdullah Öcalan, um, until 1998 when he was expelled from Syria, and then in 1999 he was captured and imprisoned in Turkey. But throughout most of the 90s, the PKK operated from Syria as its headquarters and committed atrocities in Turkey, designed it for furthering the Kurdish cause within Turkey. And so you can see the Turkish desire to enter Syria to try and deal with the PKK and offshoots of the PKK that were developing in Syria, like the YPG and the PYD. Those two offshoots still remain in Syria as part of the uh, Kurdish government that exists in the eastern part of the country. This is the expulsion from Lebanon. In 2006, the Lebanese pushed the Syrians out. The Israelis had had an occupation in the south of Lebanon from 1982 to 2000. So in 2005, um, the Syrians were pushed out of Lebanon by a million Lebanese march. But Hezbollah, right, that Syrian created proxy remained and was part of the governing coalition through most of the last 20 years. And of course, now we get to the Arab Spring, which is where a lot of the current conflict comes from. So you have the early protests in 2011, and you have a number of different entities. This is a map um, from 2017, and you can see um, Turkish movements like the FSA, you can see Kurdish forces, you can see um, the Islamic State, you have a number of different actors. During the war, Hafiz al-Assad committed numerous chemical attacks. You can see the chemical attack at Ghouta. Um, you can see uh, Turkish attacks in the northern part of Syria, trying to dislodge Kurdish forces, like when the Kurds took Afrin in March of 2018. This was the first direct Turkish involvement in the Syrian civil war, as opposed to just financially supporting proxies. The Turkish Free Syrian Army um, and the Syrian National Army became uh, their dominant proxies in the northern part of Syria. And a lot of the Syrian rebellions used the green Syrian flag, right? The flag from before the Assad dynasty. And in many ways, it symbolizes still the unification or reunification of Syria and the idea of a Syria that builds on the values of the Great Syrian Revolt in 1925, on the Constitution of 1930, and so on. And of course, in the northeast, you have the SDF, which is composed of several different Kurdish groups. SDF is the Syrian Democratic Forces. They lead a government that is Kurdish majority, but it has Arab and Assyrian members. During the Syrian civil war, of course, Palestinians living in Syria, right? Palestinians have been in Syria since 1948, since the expulsion or the flight from the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. And so these populations were targeted during rebellion. They were targeted specifically because um, organizations like Hamas, which had taken up residence in Syria, um, supported the rebels as opposed to supporting Assad, seeing because Hamas is sort of a twin of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the Muslim Brotherhood branched in Palestine. And so the Assad's anti-Islamist tendencies were those that Khalid Mashad and other leaders of Hamas were directly opposed to. You also have rebel forces targeting the camps because they saw in those camps potential fighters. Right, these are people who literally can't get jobs, they can't leave the camps. They may want a different situation in Syria, and so they might be a fertile ground to recruit from. And so you have thousands of Palestinians in Syria being directly targeted as civilians. One thing worth noting, and you can see it from the Cyber City refugee camp, Syrian Palestinians and Syrians were not treated the same way as refugees when they arrived in other Arab countries. Syrian Palestinians were sent to separate camps. Cyber City refugee camp, for example, is a Syrian Palestinian refugee camp. The Syrian refugee camp, for example, in Jordan, which is relatively close nearby, is the Atari refugee camp, and you can see it there from overhead. At its height, it had 80,000 people in it. So it's basically a city. And it's worth talking about the Syrian refugees that come out of the Syrian civil war. Syria in 2010 had a population of about 20 million people. Of that 20 million, about 5 to 7 million, we don't have exact numbers, are IDPs. Those are internally displaced persons. That means that they fled from their homes, but they haven't left Syria. So they might be from Damascus, but now they're in Aleppo, let's say. Then an additional 5 to 6 million people um, have fled outside of Syria. The vast bulk of these have stayed in the neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, um, and some even to Iraq. And then, of course, there are about a million and change that made their way further, mostly to the European Union. In Lebanon's particular case, Lebanon had a total pre-war population of 4 million people. So the population has swelled by nearly 40 to 50% because of the influx of refugees. The country has had massive difficulties accommodating them. And then, of course, no discussion of the Syrian civil war would be complete without a discussion of Islamic State, which, while now has basically receded to a few small pockets, at one point was challenging uh, most of Syria's militias for power in the country. And Islamic State was an internationalist jihadist organization designed to conquer the entire world and install an Islamist caliphate. As I've said other in other places, Islamic State is what is called a jihad state, in the meaning that similar to how Hitler's economy in Nazi Germany could only function if it continued to conquer more countries, expropriate more resources from the territories that it conquered in order to feed its industry, in order to feed its people, and so on. And it wasn't sustainable as a peaceful state, right? There's sort of like the question of like, what if Germany didn't invade Poland, right? Just stop with Czechoslovakia and that was it. Then Germany would have crashed. The economic system of Nazi Germany required further conquests. And in the same way, Islamic State requires further conquests. It uses the wealth of the regions it conquers to pay back for all the material that it uses. And also because it cannot make peace with any state that's not also part of its caliphate, it is necessarily at war with everybody all the time consistently. This organization recruited people from both Syria and Iraq, of course, but also from abroad who believed in the mission of Islamic State in creating this new caliphate, or who were brought in through the process of self radicalization, which, as I've discussed elsewhere, is a process that has very little to do with the self and much more to do with a coordinated process. Think like a YouTube algorithm that directs people towards right wing propaganda or similar. In in the early 2020s, we begin to see a rapprochement with Syria, especially after the Gaziantep earthquake in February of 2023. Gaziantep is in Turkey, but of course, it's close to the border with Syria, and therefore Syria suffered disproportionate effects. And so in 2023, you begin to see the Saudis and the Emiratis talking with Assad again, trying to normalize him so that way they can provide aid in the wake of this disaster. Of course, these countries are now normalizing relations with the new government in Syria. And of course, the most recent issues that Syria has had have come from a variety of sources. And so I'm going to try to attack this from a bunch of different angles. It might be a little bit messy. Um, in 2023, right, we have the Israeli war in Gaza. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that aspect of it, just to say that because of this, Hezbollah declared war. Sorry, Hezbollah Hezbollah declared war on Israel in order to show solidarity with Gaza. Now, you can see that most of southern Lebanon, you can see that there are areas of Lebanon that are sort of pale and areas that are more yellow. The pale areas have no major Hezbollah entrenchments, and the southern part, of course, does. And Hezbollah began to launch rockets at Israel starting in late 2023, as well as Katyusha missiles and other similar devices. Some of these landed in Israel. Israel responded with bombings until the end of September 2023, and you can see the map below, which shows what Israel and Hezbollah have targeted converse on each other's sides. On the 17th of September 2024, Israel stepped up its campaign against Hezbollah in what is known as the beeper or pager attack. These pager attacks were done where Israel, during the supply chain development of these Taiwanese pagers, managed to install a small explosive device, and those explosive devices were timed to go off consistently across Syria. Israel then launched a number of assassination bombings against leaders of uh, Hezbollah, killing the vast majority of Hezbollah's upper echelon within a few weeks. This combined with lackluster Israeli results in terms of actually marching against Hezbollah, so Hezbollah could say, at least we defended Lebanese territory, led to the ceasefire on the 27th of November 2024. Sorry, it was signed on 26th, implemented on the 27th. You can see these are two Lebanese people who had fled the southern Lebanon during the war, coming back to the area. The area had been bombed pretty extensively during the Israeli-Lebanese war. Um, and the destruction of Hezbollah's senior commanders, of course, meant that Hezbollah's control in Syria as well, because right, Hezbollah exists both in Syria and in Lebanon, would be substantially weakened. Some analysts believe that the weakening of Hezbollah because of the Third Lebanese War was what allowed uh, the new rebellion to start, right? So the new rebellion literally starts on the 27th of November. So as soon as the ceasefire exists in Lebanon, we see movement in Syria. Now, if you look on the map on the left-hand side, you can see Syria as it existed in on 27th of November 2024, and the white area is the area controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or the militia for the militia for the liberation of the Levant. I think that's the best translation you could come up with. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham begins to expand, and their first major conquest is Aleppo. Similar to how when Islamic State conquered Mosul, they acquired a lot of American technology. When HTS conquered Aleppo, they got a lot of Russian technology that had been given to the Syrians. This is a Pantsir S1. Typically, and a Pantsir S1 is an air defense unit. The Assad government claimed they had around 60 of these bought from Russia. Typically, and this is how Assad had restabilized the situation back in around 2020. Iran and Russia would be supporting him in his war to maintain control. However, Russia is substantially involved in Ukraine to the point where they couldn't even send um, air cover. And Iran is also involved in its conflict, either supporting the Houthis and the Gazans, or supporting the Russians in Ukraine with the provision of drones. So neither of those two allies could theoretically help, and so much of the Syrian government power folded rather quickly. We also see once on the 8th of December that forces from the south and forces from the north made their way to Damascus, that the Iranian embassy was stormed, the Iranian officials were expelled, and Ahmed Ashara has the leader of HTS has said that both Iranians and Israelis are not welcome in Syria. They're both seen as aggressors. Now, to say that Israel is an aggressor against Syria is nothing new, right? Syria has never made a peace treaty with the state of Israel, but to equate Iranians to Israelis in the same sentence clearly means that Syria is charting a new path outside of the Iranian sphere, where Hafiz al-Assad had anchored the country in 1982. So I want to talk a little bit about Ahmed al-Shara in terms of branding, because this is clearly a person who understands optics. You can see his picture from the upper right-hand side when he was known by his nom de guerre as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. At that time, he put himself out there as an Al-Qaeda uh, or former Al-Qaeda terrorist, jihadist, sorry, he would have called himself a jihadist. And um, he had said at that moment, and in other moments prior, that actions like 9/11 were inspiring to him. Um, he wanted to install something along the lines of an Islamic caliphate and similar. So we have a person who is not necessarily aligned with Western values, and for this he received a bounty from the U.S. government. That bounty, of course, has never been collected because he's still alive. Um, Starting with late 2024, he begins to try and reinvent himself. You can see in the upper left-hand side, this is his speech, his first speech in Damascus, which he gave at the Umayyad Mosque, which is the fourth holiest site in Sunni Islam, right? The first three are the cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. And you can see in the audience that everybody has their cell phone. Everybody's taping him. He has his military fatigues, pulling off a very sort of Zelensky type look, right? It's not that he hadn't worn military fatigues before. You can see the picture of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, where he's wearing military fatigues, but these are much more in the vein of a Zelensky outfit, where it's a clean, crisp green. He's also shaved his beard down substantially, and he no longer wears the turban, right, to appear more secular, in line with his argument that he's moved in a more secular direction. He also, you can see, meets with Christian leaders. One of the things that's worth noticing is that we have very few pictures of Ahmad al-Shara meeting with um, meeting with leaders of political parties or political constituencies, but he meets with leaders of ethnic constituencies or regional constituencies, trying to position himself above party politics and towards the unification of Syria. We also see that he has taken to a more Western style of formal dress in diplomatic settings, and he'll alternate between whether he wants to go for a full Western style of attire and outfit. You can see, for example, when he became president, which he just did 2 days ago on the 30th of January, 2025, that he wore a Western suit and tie, very slick, with two flags on either side, very similar to a Western press conference. But you can see in his meeting with the Syrian Christian leaders, he's using typical Syrian backdrops, right? He has the ornamented tables. He's got old style chairs, right? He's making it appear that he's moving between these different worlds and entertaining the particular audience that he wishes to entertain. I'm not saying that his view may or may not be suspect or otherwise. What I'm saying is that he's very good at cultivating a brand image that can transcend the different constituencies that he's trying to align to himself. Aaron, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the 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 Zelensky, or I would say the Ukrainian approach to the resistance is actually transformative. I mean, it's a combination of everything across the tactics that they used, and and when we have the other parts of the presentation, we can talk about it. But yeah, to the messaging and media operations, and I would say that one of the things that he's doing that's very um sharp operationally is he's finding these little folds, these little openings between prior alliances that either the Syrian government had or that they didn't, and he's trying to maximize them to his benefit. I could see a very substantial deal uh, with Gulf states coming, and also to uh, put Turkey off balance a little bit, but not too far. but kind of create that strategic balance, especially for development, because as much as Turkey is obviously supported and helped HTS and their proxies, their other direct proxies succeed in overthrowing and installing a new government. The Gulf is where the bulk 80-90% of the capital is going to have to come from to redevelop
Right.
the country, especially what we're talking about. I mean, this is a I mean, people don't realize. I mean, Syria has substantial debts already, hundreds of billions, and obviously, the country's been leveled. So it might get, and also look at how many refugees there are. Which there was an interesting poll that came out. I think it was last Wednesday. I'll have to dig it up, Monday or Wednesday, that 30% of the existing refugees are interested in coming back now. I mean, so it's not. I
Yeah.
mean, so that's participating in this redevelopment. So obviously, if and when the redevelopment gets going, which I don't see a lot of reasons why it wouldn't, because I think all the actors in the region, except maybe Iran, but even then, it's. I mean, do they want millions of refugees either? Right at this
Yeah.
point,
No,
I
no.
think.
Everybody wants a stable Syria, but a weak Syria,
Yeah, and
and
so
it'll be Ashar's ability whether or not he can create a strong Syria.
yeah, well, and the question is ultimately the definition of strong is different now, right? Or can
Yeah.
be. I mean, the ability to create kind of a Qatari version of Syria might be a more rational model, right? Where you have a much larger territorial reserve force, a very small active force. You keep this very dynamic approach that they took, which when we get into that part of the presentation, we talk about basically how they won, right? Which is just constantly keeping the enemy off balance.
One of the fundamental aspects of Middle Eastern policy until this situation was that in 2024 was that you had the Shiite crescent, right? Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, creating a crescent from the Persian Gulf into the Mediterranean of Iranian control against Shiite power and sorry, against Sunni power based in Saudi Arabia. And as Aaron was pointing out, if the Gulf gets more involved in Syria, this could really help break up the Shiite crescent. Already, Iran is sort of in retreat because of the fall of Syria, but that would instantiate it. You also have significant amount of Syrian refugees in Turkey. You can see on this map. And this is a map from March of 2023. The numbers went up since then, but you can see that the southern provinces of Turkey even have over 300,000 Syrian refugees. Turkey has committed to pushing most of those refugees back into Syria now that Syria has become uh, free of Assad. And Turkey's uh, uh, push into Syria can be seen in its larger policy of neo-Ottomanism, that Turkey wants to expand its political influence into the Balkans, into Central Asia, into the Middle East. And this expansion of Turkish soft power also comes with an expansion of Turkish hard power in the case of Syria, where we saw weapons, proxies, and so on. We also have Israeli airstrikes. While Assad was in power, there was the negotiation between Russians and Israelis that allowed Israel to attack uh, weapons sites or Iranian depots to a certain degree in Syria.
Uh, uh,
And
Richard, I think it'd be great if you go back to the Turkey slide, actually, because I do think the neo-Ottomanism is really important. We could kind of begin with where that started about 15 years ago. How expansive it is, both not just in the traditional backyard of Turkey, uh, what we'd call like the near abroad, but that they have taken opportunistically, especially across North Africa, and created these off balance relationships in the Gulf. And especially once the Saudis, uh, you know, committed a horrific murder of Khashoggi, and just detonated themselves for well, at least a few years politically, and Turkey became really in some ways a pathway back to legitimacy. So if you have some points, I mean that's just some higher level, and then obviously their interventions in Libya, uh, in Somalia, Azerbaijan, in the Armenian War, and
Mhm.
obviously with Syria and Iraq, um, for better part of a couple of decades. So
No, absolutely right.
yeah, and
I
now
mean,
with Ukraine, and now with Ukraine, right? I mean, you could say sort of a neo Crimean. Uh, they have a lighter touch there, but it's pretty clear given uh, what Iran and Russia were trying to do prior to the collapse of the Syrian regime, by having by going to Ankara to get Turkey to take their foot off the gas, and that didn't work. It seems like the Turks just bought a bigger gas pedal and pressed it harder, which I think that's important signaling, not just to Iran but to Russia, that your days are sort of over in our backyard. And I think that's a really big shift, and especially you talked a little bit about this, but Hezbollah is now really confined to be, a party in Lebanon at this point,
yeah,
and that's a real limit. I mean, when you get to the simplistic logistics, that's a real problem for them because they don't have a logistics channel now, right?
right.
Because
They can't go over water because they would pass through the Suez, and the Egyptians would monitor them.
that's
They
exactly
can't.
right.
They would have to go all the way around Africa, which is
Yeah,
horrendous.
and so now you're going to see this sort of smuggling drug narco kind of network level effects, which is destructive at an individual level, of course. But when you're looking at sort of wielding state power, I think I think there could be it depends on who pushes, but there could be um, a seismic shift in Lebanon next, actually, because
Yeah,
Hezbollah,
no, I agree. If Hezbollah is deracinated, you
that's
could
right.
see the rise of the March 14th coalition, right? The
That's right.
pro-West coalition.
Exactly right. So I just wanted to kind
Now,
of bring that up because maybe everyone doesn't really know
put
those
all the
other
pieces together.
elements. Yeah, yeah. And if we see big things happening in Lebanon in the next, 6 to 18 months, it's not that, this came out of nowhere, but that this is, something that's
Yeah.
in some ways almost baked into the cake.
We actually have a question about the Russian bases at Khmeimim and along the Mediterranean coast in the Latakia area. Now, the Russians were forced to abandon those bases when Assad fled on the 11th of December.
Yeah. Well, like abandoned light, I would say. I think that might be true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is, what's the latest on the future of those Russian bases? Will Turkey likely acquire them?
I you know, I doubt Turkey will acquire them. I think, especially with the it seems nationalist nature of HTS, and that they're trying to frame a unity government, that one of the critical aspects to Syria reestablishing itself, like to itself, is going to be, having very constrained power actors inside its borders, from a military standpoint, and looking to really transition, I think, pretty aggressively to economic development. So I think, that's going to be this interesting dynamic. Clearly there'll be some transitions because, whatever Russian equipment is there, they'll come up with some ways to, uh, get it back to Russia or back to somebody that, so that they're not on the hook for it. Especially once they have full, territorial responsibility. So my sense is that HTS, or this new coalitional government that they're trying to really form, a unity government, which is really going to be the key. If they could form a unity government in the next month or two of some kind, um, I don't think they're going to really tolerate substantial actors, including Turkey, having permanent bases because I just think the psyche at this point in both the opposition that came to power, like what they had to do to get there, they're not doing all that just to return back to sort of the status quo ante relationships that they had. That it just doesn't, even if it's just a new actor like Turkey. And to be honest, I don't think Turkey should want those bases. I know that in the short term that could seem like a mistake, but they don't want to be sucked into Syrian developmental politics. I mean, ultimately, what they want is Syria to be developing, Turkish companies to be benefiting, Syrian refugees from Turkey to be coming back, and the stability of the Syrian Turkish border established, and then they can work to minimize Kurdish power, or move that Kurdish power further down the Syrian peninsula. I mean, I think ultimately that's what Turkey should be working on, is figuring out how to incorporate, and this is going to be hard for them. So, sort of political psychology, given how Turkey feels about Kurds, uh, getting the Kurds higher stakes in the Syrian coalitional government so that the
Yep.
Kurds can move and integrate further down into Syria, move those hundreds of kilometers down. And then that's how you ultimately defang a lot of the conflict. Like you create an economic deconfliction zone, which I think Turkey can live with, or should be able to live with. But that's going to be a real test for both Turkey. Is that, are they mature enough to sort of realize this, or are they just going to go back to airstrikes against Kurds, and that'll just shift the conflict back to the prior status quo ante of a Turkish Kurdish, and then that will tick off a big chunk of Syrians eventually, right? Because there'll be Turkish military operations inside Syria that aren't authorized by them, and that'll hurt Turkey. I mean, if the Turks want to push the Syrians to the Gulf, that will be what they'll do it, and then they'll have a long term. They'll be frozen in state basically with the Syrians and Turks, and so this will be a test of Turkey's maturity. Can they can they can they can they take the win right now and turn it into 2 or 3 wins, or do they take the win and turn it into basically a neutral, because they add a loss to it, and that's going to be an interesting this next year or two. So I don't know if that, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. During, as I was saying, the Russians and the Israelis had coordinated the ability of Israel to bomb areas within Syria, areas where there were Syrian military or Iranian military assisting the Syrian military. And this should give us a precedent for why Israel was so capable of Syrian airstrikes in the post-independence period. So this is my last slide. Aaron has a number of slides after this, but I sort of wanted to sort of catch up to what happened after December 8th, right? So a few different things. The As part of the expansion southward, you have a situation where the Kurds of SDF also expanded as HTS was moving southward, and they expanded into Arab majority areas. To be fair, they controlled Arab majority areas previously to HTS's move southward, but this expanded further. So you begin to see Turkish pushback, Turkish-led proxy pushback in the northwest. That's in areas like Manbij on the western bank of the Euphrates River, where the SNA, which is a Syrian National Army, which is a Turkish proxy, fought against several SDF units, most of them being YPG, and pushed them back to the eastern bank of the Euphrates River. The U.S. tried to negotiate a ceasefire between the two coalitions, and did so, but the ceasefire has been broken since, and it's unclear whether Kurds will be able to continue to hold the northwestern parts of the territory that they controlled. In the southeast, there's the city of Deir ez-Zor, which is a majority uh, Arab city that came under SDF control on the 8th of December. Now, those areas had protests. This is a protest actually from 2017, but those areas had protests for a few days before SDF relented and gave that area over to HTS aligned entities because the population of Deir ez-Zor sees SDF as a Kurdish army, not as a Syrian army. There was a famous slogan that they uttered: 100% of the jails are Arab. What kind of justice is that, right? Um, the Kurds argue that there are a majority of Arabs in prison because more of the members of Islamic State and the members that they've been fighting against were Muslims, but they do have some Kurds in their jails. Um, at the same time, in the southwest of Syria, Israel launched an invasion. Israel argued that the Syrian rebels could not secure the Syrian side of the UNDOF zone, and therefore several UN peacekeepers came under fire. In order to protect Israel and those UN peacekeepers, Israel was going to launch a temporary war in order to secure key territorial areas within both the UNDOF and the Syrian side just east of the UNDOF. One of those areas just to the east of the UNDOF is the top of Mount Hermon, which is the tallest peak in Syria and would give a key vantage point into Lebanon and towards Damascus. Otherwise, Syria has taken over a number of Israel's taken over a number of positions in Syria close to the UNDOF and a number of Syrian towns that had existed in that area. While Israel claims that this is temporary, Israel is also building military facilities in this area, in these areas. You also have questions in Syria about whether or not the coalition will actually include voices from all sides. One of the biggest points of conflagration was when a Christmas tree was set alight in Sulaybiya. There were Christian marches throughout the country, and Ahmed Ashara declared that the people who set the tree on fire were foreigners and would be arrested. So far, nothing has happened. It's also worth pointing out that the Syrian Transitional Government is almost all HTS members. Members of other armies have been recruited at lower levels, such as provincial governors, but the main coalition of transitional leaders have all come from HTS, which also leads some questions as to the orientation of HTS. All right, Aaron.
All right, great. Um, so I think I just want to start off with a little bit of maps and lines on maps, which I think is important for those of you that don't have a lot of background with sort of Syria and or haven't followed it as much because what happens is you get sort of war fatigue. So that's the Syrian map and the 20 to 24 power sort of balance between the government and the non-governmental forces, being on the yellow side and the green side up by the Turkish border. And then this was the situation, about a few weeks ago, in terms of, I'm sorry, about a year ago, in terms of, the distribution of forces, who was considered a loyalist, a regional force, rebels, Federation forces from the SDF, and then foreign forces. Great, and this is the very fast collapse from November 27th to the 6th of December, really over a course of about a week and a half of the regime. So they had a problem in Aleppo. It sort of accelerated in Hama and Homs, and then it collapsed in Damascus, basically. So we'll talk about how that happened. I think that's an important component. I want to cover a little bit about other factors, because I think one of them that isn't discussed is the economy and drugs. In a lot of ways, Syria's economy became like the worst of Argentina or Zimbabwe from a an economic standpoint in the last 5 years. Not that it was a fantastic economy for the 8 years before that during the Civil War, but it had some degree of stability. But then it just completely imploded as the opposition forces became, I would say, crafty when it came to using internal economic and sort of business strategy against the regime, and then the regime was really forced to drive around a lot of illicit activity. And that's really arguably what it was. It was really a failed state that hadn't failed yet. And so you see this with the currency. And the Syrian pound used to be, 40, 50, 60 to the dollar, and then it fell 500x, which is pretty unsustainable for any society. And you see this with power generation, that the regime could not sustain power, literally power. I don't mean political power, I mean energy power. And the opposition, the SDF, became the provider of power generation in its region, so that there was a legitimacy that they were able to construct, so that it wasn't just a military operation, it was a economic operation, which I think is what makes this a little more interesting and novel, in how sophisticated that they evolved to. And especially given all the actors they were up against. They were up against, what most people 5 years ago would say is pretty high impossibility, whether it was Iran or Russia, Syria, at times Turkey, Iraq, other actors. I mean, really everybody, the U.S. even at times. And they were able to, in a crafty way, dispatch each of those either economically or politically or militarily, or turn them into, neutral allies. And I don't know, Richard, if you want to add to this either. This is, I think, really important. Most of you, well, I don't know, many of you might not have heard of this drug. It's not, thank goodness, that popular in North America, but it really exploded, or has exploded, across the Middle East and North Africa, and into even parts of Southern Europe and Central Asia. So Captagon is not a good drug, as most aren't. From an illicit standpoint, and Syria has become the center of it, or was the center of it, from a global trade. And it was really in the tens of billions. And so Syria really became a narco state. And on the right, the commander of the 4th Armored Division, which I don't even know kind of what that means when the main responsibility of the 4th Armored Division is running the drug trade. So it's really just like a brand. I mean, like the armor they have are the vehicles that they're moving the drugs in across, the region. But that is Assad's brother, so the younger son. So he obviously developed himself into more of the cartel head, kind of persona. It's really important because I think ultimately what it did is, in this kind of shows you all the drug trade routes throughout the region, and is that this triggered an external response by other state actors, right? The Jordanians bombed 4th Armored Division, well, transport vehicles, basically, right, of the drugs coming into to Jordan, and so there became a shift in policy by a lot of the regional actors because of the externalities, the costs that have been generated from this, from the explosion of the drug itself in their societies, and that really helped HTS and the opposition. Uh, I would say have more soft allies than you would expect, because they could cut a deal saying, "Hey, look, whatever we disagree with, we all agree that we want to get rid of this drug trade, and we will. And when we get rid of the regime, we'll get rid of the trade," which is, absolutely what it looks like is going on right now. And all those routes have basically been collapsing.
I was gonna
Whatever's
say
in the
they're
distribution channel outside of Syria is still going through, but now it's, you're seeing the end of the line, and obviously that trade is now going to fragment, and the development of it's going to fragment, but because it is a chemical operation, the way you would think of meth or many of the
yeah,
others,
it's a
all
manufactured
modern.
drug. It's not
Yeah,
grown.
yeah,
Um,
it's like all the synthetics that are now the main drivers of the drug trade. Um, but so anyways, the other key, I would say ingredient, but probably wrong choice of words there. The other key component to this, um, that I believe is really important, is that the regime became corrupt from the interior, because of the illicit trades that they were in. So the officer corps, a lot of the natural bribery that existed really just exploded, maybe, orders of magnitude, which changes everything from your combat effectiveness to your training. Like, are you even spending your budgets on your training? I mean, your weapons, everyone's just selling everything. I mean, you're basically imploding within itself, and that's in further slides that we can go into. If you can follow the next slide.
I just wanted to add, we have
Yep.
like, because we talked about how Ahmed Ashara is really great at social media. He's shown many
Yes.
like social media videos of just like oil barrels full of Captagon
Yep.
on fire,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Totally unnecessary, but
Yep.
really sends the kind of message of like we're taking care of this shit. You see, we're burning
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, it's and each of those barrels is worth, who knows what, $500,000 or a million,
Yeah.
$2 million on the street. Yeah, and they had even, like a whole, not a whole field, but like a whole group of dozens of, maybe 50 barrels plus, so they were, burning tens of millions to maybe up to 100 million worth of the Captagon, which is going to make a big deal. And you see how the regime, just from 2019, producing in the hundreds of around 100 or so kilograms equivalent, and now 4,000, right? So you're talking about 4,000 metric tons of, and then remember, this is pre-split. So once it gets to the through the drug distribution channel, it's getting split, 5-3, 5-1, whatever. So this is just like I mean, you could argue, almost like at a UN World Health level, that just turning over this regime is a massive benefit to, a huge part of Middle East and North Africa for, really tens, hundreds of millions of people, because you're not going to have, thousands of metric tons. And also they exploded. I'd say one that kind of most people don't appreciate is that they really started exploding their meth development, right? They crossed over 1,000 tons of meth. So, in theory, the regime would have just kept going, and you'd get to some point where they'd have 10,000 tons of Captagon and 5,000 tons of meth, and at that point, you objectively, Syria's then a top 2, 3, 4 drug state in the planet at that point. So, it's um, so this was a big deal, I think, and it obviously also impacted the tens of billions in earnings that they had, and all the other illicit networks. So it isn't just the drugs, the corruption that it generates in the military leadership, The money. It's also the networks themselves, right? Because through those networks, they were able to acquire all kinds of other illicit goods. So I want to talk a little bit, or kick off a little bit, about kind of the collapse of the Syrian army leadership, which is really just didn't start. It accelerated the last 5 years. And the quality, the force readiness, the corruption, which is a lot of the pieces we talked about. And these are summaries from Peru, and I have a whole list of different references that this presentation, and we do a follow on that we could maybe drill down in references. But there's been this shift in what it is to be a Syrian army officer. It always had a state corruption component to it, obviously, but it shifted more to a criminal corruption position. And when that happened, then all of the incentives, all of the drivers of leadership radically shifted. Because one thing to not minimize is that the Syrian army, in terms of material at its peak, was one of the largest army. It was one of the 10 largest or so armies in the world. It was a huge army, a massive, massive land and armor force. A fairly decent size fixed wing aircraft. Obviously, their strategic relationships with Russia going back decades. Provided them enormous amounts of material, and that army basically degraded naturally through the civil war, in the simplest way, in that the civil war was an asymmetrical conflict, right? And so, just like people have seen, the U.S. military has had to completely reform itself because he fought an asymmetrical conflict for 15 plus years. This is a more extreme version of that. And then you add this kind of death blow, really, I think, with the shift to criminal corruption. And basically, it was just hollowed from the inside out. That's why you saw, you could find these crazy videos where Toyota Technicals are two or three of them are charging armored columns, and the soldiers in the tanks and the armored BMPs get out and run. And I mean, these are Toyota trucks with that you get. I mean, they're Helix ones that we can't buy here because we have our ridiculous restrictions on buying the best trucks probably ever made. But these are Toyota trucks that you can buy from dealerships in most of the world, and they're just and obviously the Syrian forces are like, hey, I didn't sign up. I signed up for Capticon, transport. I didn't sign up for fighting in a real conflict with somebody shooting back. So you saw this type of behavior, and these weren't one off. This was pretty consistent. Thanks. Yeah. So this kind of details like on the amount. So one interesting thing that happened is that there was, at the same time this corruption was going on, there was a massive demobilization of more senior reserve and officers, which you might call the final remnants of the professional cadre. The ones that really took this, at least more seriously. Maybe they were traditional regime corrupt, like many are or can be, but they were not criminally corrupt, right? Or they didn't want to be, and they went back to regular life or tried to. And so you have these sort of multiple whammies between the being an asymmetrical war, the corruption, the demobilization while this asymmetrical war is going on, which is totally insane. It doesn't make any sense. And then if you look on the right, you could see what many commanders were already starting to report. Obviously there was false reporting going on. There was, it became basically hollowed out as a force. Yep. So here's a bunch of references that so Peru, and if you don't know Peru on YouTube, hopefully most of you do if you follow anything with Ukraine. I was able to get a lot of good information from that. Plus Carnegie Endowment, Italian Institute for International Political Studies. It's very underrated. They have a fantastic research service, CSIS, and so on. Yeah, so the one aspect that transformed this conflict was Ukraine. So fairly indirectly, but Ukraine's template of attacking weak spots in Russian forces, especially early on, and acquiring the Russian equipment. And so, one amazing aspect of this conflict is that HTS acquired about 90% of its armor from the Syrian armed forces. So they would find former tank operators and tank maintenance specialists, put them on, sort of like behind the assault team, like maybe there'd be the first 3-4 technicals, and then they'd be on the follow on, and then once the forces fled, they would come in and and kick off the maintenance and or find the equipment. Many times the equipment wasn't even maintained, so they would actually begin a maintenance cycle with the equipment, so they were actually supporting the Syrian equipment themselves, and then obviously repurposing it. So so in one way, what is transformative and unique about HTS is that it's not a traditional extreme minority group, fighting a civil war, but that it has very strong, I'd say, across society coalitional dimensions and I believe aspirations. I think the test is going to be, do they bring a lot of these other actors in, and what type of we'll call it de-Baathification do they really do, right? I mean, do they take the lessons of Iraq and others and, let's say, smartly de-Baathize, right? I mean, a non psychopathically, criminally corrupt sergeant who had no other options but is willingly, not corrupt or that corrupt in normal terms, are they redeemable? Because they can't, I mean, we saw it after World War II, right? I mean, in the end, if we wanted to go after everyone who had Nazi sympathies in, Europe, I mean, we would have, had to create a prison system of probably at least 5 to 10 million,
And there wouldn't be governments.
and there wouldn't be governments, and who would work in these prisons. I mean, it just doesn't, you reach the, it's like I've always told people, there's lots of versions of too big to fail. It's not just the global financial crisis, right? I mean, there's a certain version, and I don't believe Syria is to that scale, but within the size of what they have to work with, it's very similar. And the question is, do they want to be fighting a retributive conflict there, or do they want to be shifting it to a more normal state? So that's going to be, I think, a very important test for them in the next few months. I think, yeah. So this, I want to show the Turkish slide, or Turkish-ish. So they're clearly, Turkey obviously said, well, what HTS, revolution, right? Obviously, Turkey's had a very strong hand in this, which my belief, and we won't see this probably for years to come, but I'm sure with tacit support from pretty much all the other actors, because there was a sense of, well, if you really believe you could get this done, yeah, go for it. And so I think what's going to be very interesting is how fast does Turkey and then others normalize with the new regime, because now they owe them that, right? They really do, right? Because if they put them in this position now where they now have a state, well, they now need to step, to operate the state. And there's some very basic pieces that I think most people don't think about. Uh, the health system, the education system, and the power system. Right? You're not going to get people back to the country if those three things aren't working. And they don't have to be perfect, but they have to be getting worked on. And what a lot of people don't realize, just at a practical level, that a huge amount of refugees who left, uh, um, Syria during the war, were, we'll call them apolitical type engineers, who obviously support, lots of the infrastructure in the country. An enormous amount of professional women who obviously supported the health and the education system in the country. And it's going to be absolutely essential that they find a pattern, a path, a way to be able to safely bring those people back and stand up those three pieces. And those three pieces, I think, are going to be the determinant, at least this next 12 months to 24 months, how Syria can actually, um, get itself regenerated as just a basic functioning state, and then begin this decades long redevelopment process that's probably going to take, a few, decades, and probably $500 billion. So I know we could go to questions now. Oh, you're on mute still.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, and Aaron's commentary is always really incisive. I'd completely forgotten about Captagon until you brought it up. Um,
Mhm. just a
so
little just a little drug thing happening in the Middle East to tens of millions of young men and women now, actually, which is sad. It's just, yeah, it's exploded.
yeah, no, I was gonna say, if does anybody have any questions before we go to the online questions? The first question is, now that the Muslims have recaptured the country from the Alawites, do you believe that it will become paradise on earth? Um, I I think that's a little extreme. I think that it will certainly not be the terror state that the Assads ran, right? I don't see any continual linkage between Ahmed al-Shara and the people who are in his contingent, or regardless of if I have any negative thoughts about them. And I put out some of my questions during our presentation today, right? Like, what will he treat the minorities well? Is he much more concerned about brand image than actually about creating the end result, so on? But I think that I have a lukewarmly positive future view for Syria in that I expect it to become, I want to say, Latvia, like
Yeah.
that would be where I picture him sort of taking the country, a country that's not really notable. Life is fine. You have internal minorities that cause problems. In Latvia's case, it's the Russians. Um, but generally speaking, things work, and there's no massive repressive state. So I think for a lot of Syrians, that will be a positive turn. The next question, somebody's asking about me doing a presentation on India. Um, I don't have expertise on India, so that's not going to happen. Do you think that Shah will become more antagonistic towards Israel once the new government consolidates power and builds strength in the next 10 years? I think that that is more likely. Um, we have to remember that Syria and Israel have had an antagonistic relationship since the beginning of Israeli independence. And I would further say that the main problem that Syria has right now is the Israeli incursion in the southwest, right? Um, and it's really poor form, at least in my view, that Israel is occupying sovereign Syrian territory when Syria didn't declare war on Israel um, in the last 5 years, let's say. Certainly not with this new government, which has repeatedly issued that it believes in the ceasefire of 1974 and the UNDOF. So I think that there will probably be some attempt to either reconquer those additional territories or reconquer even the Golan from Israel. I don't know how successful it'll be, but I can imagine Syria wanting to do that in the next 10 years if they gather their strength. Um,
Yeah, I would add to that. I think objectively, this shift in Syrian state existence now actually creates a new dilemma for Israel. Because having the prior, you know, failed Syrian state uh, fit this era's version of Netanyahu's approach to uh, regional conflict, basically. But now you have let's say a Latvian model of development. I don't know. It's somewhere between Latvia and Moldova. It would be my
yeah,
my
yeah, you know what?
running
I like
guess.
Moldova better. Yeah,
I like it a little better too. And But objectively, right, a state that is not looking to generate any conflicts externally is looking to just, let's be real, focus on economic development, power generation, trade, education, and health, rebuilding. Uh, so an Israel that is, uh, let's say unnecessarily engaging. I mean,
belligerent.
so yeah, belligerent. Now there is a business case, which is the Hezbollah piece that has something there. The question is Israel able, mature enough to sit down with either a proxy negotiator or with the new Syrian government to basically step in and take those roles over. And the Syrians have every bit, if not more, of an incentive to not allow Hezbollah establishment in any of its territory, anyways. So it's sort of a win-win. What's going to be most interesting for me to look at what's going to happen with Syria. I believe in the Gulf deal is done. I think the Gulf is all in on Syria because they understand this is their one shot that they're ever going to get, like one shot every 100 years maybe, and
Yeah,
this is it. So they're going to take it, and they'll be successful with that. The question will be which European uh, state, whether it's Italy or France or both, sort of steps in, and then they play, the API, the interface to the rest of the world with this
yeah.
new Syrian regime. Because if that's the case, that's going to put pressure on Israel eventually to have to cut some deal, because the support that they get, that Italy and France gives Israel, is substantial in Europe, obviously. So,
Yeah.
I see something happening there. I can buy as Israel, given all the things going on right now. Want to have a wait and see, make sure there's stability, et cetera, et cetera. They don't want to give back. They don't want to pay for the real estate twice. Totally understand that. But at some point, as you start seeing all of the MENA regimes establish embassy, as things start to normalize, which is going to be one of the tests the next 3 to 6 months in Syria, then I think, Israel's going to have, this is going to turn from an awkward situation into an untenable one over time.
I agree. And it sort of falls into the next question of, do you think Israel will withdraw from the buffer zone? I think that if Syria maintains the position that they're maintaining, which is that we're not going to engage, and Israel just looks like a bully, I think there will be a lot of international pressure for Israel to withdraw. I don't know if they will, um, and then the question is, do they intend to withdraw? I would say that Israel does not intend to withdraw from the slopes of Mount Hermon. I think that from the Israeli perspective, that's a necessary position. I do believe that they would be more inclined to withdraw from the UNDOF zone otherwise, um, from the city of Al-Qunitra, from Hadera, from there are several
Yep.
different towns in the Dera government that they now control. I don't see any long-term strategic Israeli benefit for that. Um, the Israelis also, I don't know if this is a common position in Israel or not, but if Israelis were trying to get to Asweda, to get to the Druze
Yeah,
majority regions, um, and create a Druze puppet state, the Druze have made it quite clear in Syria that they're not interested in that.
yeah,
They sort of follow the Sultan al-Atrash model of like one Syria, even we as Druze fight for Syria.
yeah.
So I think that Israel will, even if they make it there, they'll find very quickly that they don't have a useful ally. So I think Israel
Yeah,
will withdraw from those territories. I just don't
yeah.
think they'll withdraw from Mount Hermon.
I think Israel has a lot of interesting dilemmas now that this shifts to, right? So when Israel was supporting uh some of the Kurdish fighters some of the time, strategically and surgically, it made sense, right? Because it was just a chaotic, asymmetrical, it was just a great big prison riot basically was going on in that region. But as you start having a stable state, or at least let's just put it this way, a non-expeditionary conflictual state that is trying to get some stability. All of Israel's sort of playbook of off balancing, uh, which works when there's chaos or works to achieve something, if it's targeted correctly when there's chaos, is effective, but it's not effective once there's some stabilizing actors. And I think Israel is not right now politically oriented and engineered to handle these changes. I think in some ways they're very static right now, and it's going to be very interesting to see, does someone help them get unstuck, because it's only going to hurt them more than it hurts anybody else. There's one maybe justification in the next year, is that if Israel is intending on large scale operations in Lebanon, which with the old Syrian regime might have made more political sense, but now Israel will then just be contributing to regional chaos, right? Because you'll just see a huge amount of Lebanese refugees going into Syria, right? And which will just be this very, it won't be effective to what Israel wants to support. But at the end of the day, if all they care about is eliminating Hezbollah, which I don't know if you can. I don't think you can, because after a year and a half fighting in Gaza, who's Israel still negotiating with to get the hostages back? But Hamas, it might be 80%, 70% degraded Hamas, but it's that's what they still have. And Hezbollah's entrenchment in Lebanon is, I'd say, infinitely wider than Hamas is in Gaza at scale, right? Meaning all of the actors that they have. Now, the only thing that could change that is Iran. How does Iran deal with losing all these proxies this fast? Do they move to a much more arm's length relationship with Hezbollah? That changes, I think, some of the equation. So I do think this next year is a pivotal year in how these actors respond. And if the Syrians play their cards right, they could be in a pretty, I mean, relatively speaking, as good as that can be, a decent position if they have the Gulf and the Turks on their side and they're getting French and Italian aid, and that's helping them get to some type of EU, UN like sustainment. One thing we can't forget is that the Russians pulling out of Syria also meant the Russians stopped providing grain, but the Ukrainians stepped in to provide grain and have guaranteed grain for all of 2025 without paying for it, right? So this is like their humanitarian aid. Is very smart,
Branding.
branding
Well,
and soft power kind of application, which then, of course, puts pressure on the Turks to allow this to happen and get ships through the Bosphorus, which then, gives Ukrainian more legitimacy to have ship vessels going through the Bosphorus. It's a feedback loop, right?
Yeah. So
So
there are a few questions that I sort of want to answer as sort of lightning questions
yeah.
because they're relatively simple. How can you say Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is extremist when they fought Khawarij groups like ISIS and separate from Al-Qaeda? You can fight Khawarij groups and still be Khawarij yourself. You know, what the test for
Crips fight Bloods, right? They're still
yeah,
Crips, or
exactly.
Bloods fight
For
Crips,
sorry,
or
for
whatever.
those who are not familiar with Islamic theology, Khawarij are groups that sit outside of the Sunni and Shiite fold. It's a common um, term applied to jihadist organizations by Muslims. Um, so jihadist organizations have killed other jihadist organizations. That's just, that's part of the course. What will be interesting to see is what HTS does now that they have political power. Signs look decent. They don't look amazing, right? You have the
Yeah.
Syrian Minister of Education adding creationism to the school curriculum and doing all kinds of weird things like that. So, six to
Also
one, half
known
a
as
dozen to the other.
Wednesday.
Also
Also
known as
known as
Wednesday.
Wednesday.
Next question. Why have Egypt, Jordan, and the Emirates shown tacit hostility towards the regime change? I wouldn't say that for the Emirates. I think the Emirates has been relatively welcoming. Um, Egypt and Jordan are sort of waiting for the American position before they make any calls because the alliance with the Americans is more important than their situation with Syria, which was negative for the last 40 years. Um, do you think the
But
new government will?
by the way, before you get there, I think this also creates a dilemma for the United States too. I think
Yeah,
once again, in a lot of ways, the U.S. And it wouldn't have mattered who's in charge, to be honest, because we had a very and it's not just Israel, but a very fixed view that almost every actor did, that this is just what Syria is, and there's bad guy over here, bad guy over there, and it just was like that's just another day in the life. Send me the next report. But now you actually have to put energy in understanding all these actors and where they're going, their all their trajectories, their new trajectories with all their new relationships and alliances. So you can't just sort of give things an easy blanket no. I mean, you can, but then you can't be shocked when you say no and the Qataris, or eventually, which would be my prediction, it might take another year or two, someone like MBS, steps in. And then, when MBS steps in, you pay attention pretty quickly. Everyone in the world
yeah.
does. As my friend says, he's the she of the Middle East, which is sort of true, I think, actually. Uh,
The next question is, do you think that the new Syrian government will try to negotiate with Turkey regarding Hatay region, Alexandretta? No. I think that they are too reliant on
yeah,
Turkey for anything like that to happen. Um,
yeah.
why do you think there was no resistance from the Alawite population in December? That was actually something that I personally am very curious about. Um, what the evidence that I've seen is basically that they think that whatever new is coming is probably better than the
Has to be
Holocaust system
better.
they had before.
Yeah,
I think the drug smuggling is probably the easiest place to point to because the Alawites are the area along the coast where all
yep,
of that would have been exported. They probably just wanted an end to the cartels.
yep.
There's a question here. I find it hard to put our hope of a better Syria with Ahmed al-Shara. He's an ex-Al Qaeda fighter, and it reminds me of our old freedom fighters. Um, yeah, that's fair. Um,
I mean, I do think it's a little different in that um, he and they can't sustain governance at all very long unless there's a huge amount of legitimacy by outside actors, which is going to involve a lot of constraining pressure in governance, right? I mean, the Gulf is not writing checks for chaos. Um, the Turks are not going to write checks or create support, put new power systems in, blah blah blah, for chaos. France and Italy is not going to do the same. So I think um, Ukraine is not going to give grain away for chaos. It's so a lot of the constraining forces, I think, are going to be substantial, which is going to create challenges for them because they're going to have to they're going to have to step up. They're going to have to mature, or find others in their, in their newer coalition that can do that. Uh, because the facts on the ground are going to dictate this in the end, right? You're not going to have, next Christmas, I guarantee you're not going to have 100-foot Christmas tree burning, right? I mean, they're just
Yeah.
they're not stupid. I mean, people
Yeah.
can be stupid, but they're not. They have not shown an inclination to reinforce stupidity. Let's put it that way so far.
And they've also shown that they're really great at optics.
That's
So
right.
the Christmas tree burning was the accident, not
That's
not
right.
like it's not
It's the bug. It's not the
it's the
feature
bug,
in the
not the feature.
software. That's right.
Um,
That's right.
Next question: can it be said that Bashar al-Assad did anything to help the Gazan people, or was this just a charade to give his regime legitimacy? I don't even know what Assad claimed to be doing on behalf of the Gazan people. Like,
Yeah, I don't know either.
okay, so
Yeah.
then no.
I mean, you
Um,
could say in some general way, having a flag day, and the usual
yeah, exactly.
marches, lots of green bandanas and flags, and coffin covers, things like that. But nothing tangible.
Yeah, no, I would say that even prior to the Syrian civil war, the assistance to any of the Palestinian organizations almost never flowed through Syria,
That's
or
right.
rather flowed from Syria. If it flowed through Syria, it was Iranian. Um, n- uh, there's a question of how much do you think that Israel's defanging of Hezbollah impacted the decision to start the offensive? Because the offensive was clearly planned, but but you know
Yeah.
the timing
So
seems too suspect.
yeah, I'm not really uh buying that one, or like, some kind of, magical alignment, all the pieces. I mean, I think, if I'm going to be very honest, the drivers that allowed them to do this in less than 2 weeks are, I'll go through this real quick. The last 5-10 years, they had fantastic small unit force development, platoons, companies, even light battalions. They were built around mobility and light maneuver and their force composition. Lots of lessons learned from Ukraine. They created an integrated leadership and command and control, like at a brigade level, deep intelligence. They created all this constant probing and built their combat effectiveness around that while scaling their forces. And then there's some very, very like basic things they did. They acquired tens of thousands of night vision goggles. Uh, that's a difference. They stockpiled all the heavy weapons they could get, and they had strategies to acquire more, uh, and repurposing it. And then I would say the big thing they applied, and I really think was fundamental, that they built their own little drone air force, tens of thousands of small UAVs, thousands of mid-level ones, all built off of very Ukrainian standards. They were called Falcon brigades, which I guess is Shaheen brigades, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and it was all local production and integration. And so this was all mini Ukrainian-like strike teams. And then the big thing is how they applied it. I would say they were even more effective than Ukraine in applying it, right? They attacked all this key node targeting they did right across different forces, leadership, high value targets, support depots. They did shock strikes. Uh, so when you put all that together, that is really what accumulated in it, and that gave them this ability to take and I think this is somewhat unique, to take a fairly asymmetrical force and hybridize it to make it more symmetrical, or let's just say symmetrical enough that it could knock down another mostly symmetrical force, right? So that's what they applied here, which I think was effective in a weird way. I've sort of seen this as their version of, if you remember at the beginning of right after 9/11, when the US brought in small, medium amounts of special forces uh, and other government agency personnel, and linked them up with the Northern Alliance, and they built this really ultimately asymmetrical, but at key points of power distribution in the fight became very symmetrical, like it form up almost like Terminator, just formed up into something symmetrical for a short period of time, provided that punching power, and distributed the force again, and just kept reforming that way. In a lot of ways, I actually see what they did is their version of this, which is very unique, actually. So I
Yeah,
do think that gives pause to other actors that, hey, let's make sure these guys keep their copycat Chinese Armani suits on all the time. And, and maybe eventually real ones from Italy. And, on the discount racks, instead of putting back their fatigues and their drone goggles and sitting in little bunkers with, iPads targeting things, or, Galaxy pads. So I do think
exactly.
that's something real here. Like, that's a shock value in the region, and they seem to want to do that, or at least that's the messaging. So, to me, that's the opportunity here. Is like, these guys want to put their suits on. Let's let them keep putting their
Yeah,
suits on and do stuff all day long on laptops, like buy things and make markets and build more, power distribution
yeah,
centers and phone networks and everything else. Because I think that's
exactly.
probably a better use of their time.
I think also, and this sort of goes to the next question on the list, is did anybody expect Assad to fall in 11 days? I don't think even HTS expected Assad to fall in 11 days.
No, of course
The
not.
lack of resistance that they got at every place that they fought.
Yeah,
Yes, the army was hollowed out, but they should have resisted more. So
of
I don't think
course.
anybody was expecting it to be in 11 days. Next
That's
question
right.
is, in Syria, does ethnicity, religion, or just anti-Assad sentiment have the most influence on how different groups conduct themselves, and what does society value most? I think that's actually a really great question.
It's a great
Um,
question.
I don't think we know enough about Syria now to say. I would say that religion is certainly a key point of identity for anybody who's not Sunni. Um, and ethnicity is a key point for anybody who's not Arab. But this becomes the sort of, what does it feel to be a white person? Sort of argument. If you're not familiar, right? If you talk to people who are in the racism space, the anti-racism space, um, that there's a clear sentiment about what it feels like to be black, or what it feels like to be Hispanic, what it feels like to be Asian, because of discrimination or targeting or whatever. But white people don't focus on what it feels like to be white, because white is the norm. And I think that that sort of exists in the Syrian world as well. If you're a Sunni Arab, that's the norm, especially with this new government. And so people are seeing themselves in relationship to that. And if you're Sunni Arab, then you identify based on your city, or based on your regional politics, or um, whether you were pro-Assad or anti-Assad, or what have you. Although now everybody's going to say that they're anti-Assad, because who
Yeah.
wants to be on the losing side?
Yeah.
So I think that's how people are going to identify first.
One
If they're
other
outside,
point I
yeah,
want to make that I think is important here is this is going to, you're going to be able to judge this by the priority in redevelopment in Syria. Because in areas that have different ethno-religious cultural composition, uh, or at least did before, which I assume will maintain some of that when everybody comes back. People tend to coalesce unless there's some astronomical environmental event that prevents that area from even existing anymore. People tend to recoalesce at least 50% or whatever to the prior population. Um, that the Syrian government, how it provincially manages those areas, meaning when you have a province that is on aggregate, not a Sunni majority, but a Sunni minority, is there either a very open, flexible Sunni majority governor, or a Sunni governor, or is there a non-Sunni governor that's part of the governing coalition? And it's okay, right? It doesn't look like there's a game of spoils going on. That's going to be a real test of these questions, which is going to determine how much of those other populations come back. That's why this was probably the best question today, because there is one substantial risk, is that if you were part of a minority population in Syria and you think it's turning into a Sunni ethnic state, then your belief of coming back as a priority is going to, drop or become eliminated, really. I mean, you're just going to find somewhere else to live in the world or in the region. So that will have a huge implications on the redevelopment of Syria, because how many of those people served in various capacities in, education, infrastructure, health, whatever,
Yeah, especially under the Assad
ministries.
regime, which promoted
Exactly.
minorities.
That's right. That's right. So that's going to be, I think, a big, like, if I'm being very honest, that's probably one of their 3, 4 biggest challenges, tests that they're going to have to navigate. Um, and it's going to be tricky, because
Yeah,
there are certain regime loyalists that come from certain minority groups that you don't want to repatriate, right? Or need to be on criminal trial, right? Like prosecution for crimes against the state, basically. Um, where do you do that, right? And where do you not do that? And given how what the patrilineal model is in Syria, or maybe always was, and just continue to get amplified in the modern era, that brings a lot of risks on, because if you're prosecuting, Uncle Ahmed or whatever, Uncle
yeah.
Joe, then what do
Then
the
people are going
other,
to get inflamed.
yeah, 40 members of the family, the clan, and their associated partner clans, and blah blah blah, and you start going down those old roads. That's what's going to be important, is that, like, we're prosecuting Joe, but you know Miriam is also getting promoted in the education ministry,
Yeah,
right? Like, there's this kind of tit for tat where it makes sense that you can offset some of uh that anger, and people can reconcile, like, yeah, ultimately, yeah, Joe is actually a pretty bad guy, right? It's like, yeah, he
yeah.
might be my uncle, but that's what it
So
is. And that's going to be important for them to reconstruct, because if you don't do this, it's just going to turn in, I think, ultimately, to a Sunni, uh like, really just another Sunni state, really, over time. um
the next question is, does the Damascene Aleppine split still exist? Yes, it does. As I mentioned, Hafiz al-Assad, got most of his power from the south, from the Damascus wealthy. Now that there's going to be probably more integration with Turkey and much more economic stimulus and growth, I imagine there will be a shift back to Aleppo, where Aleppo will have a much greater seat of power. Damascus will still be the capital city, but Aleppo will be now much more integrated with Turkey and therefore much more of a trade hub. Aleppo is still, generally speaking, more educated than Damascus. Damascus has more university graduates, but Aleppo has the culture of it. Um, and so I think that the divide will be reinvigorated, but it'll be flipped in the other direction, that Aleppo will become the dominant cultural center.
and it always
Um,
should have been. It
yeah,
always should have been. I mean, I think this was just a byproduct of the
of cutting
dynamics
the
of,
border. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And so Aleppo always made more sense logistically, territorially, access to the whole region, trade networks. Like, if you were going to build a trade hub with freight rail throughout the region, or one day I'm sure they will, it might take 10, 20, 30 years, but eventually, where are you going to terminate that? You're not terminating that in Damascus. It doesn't make sense. You're going to do it in Aleppo, and then you're going to have corridor from Aleppo to Damascus, or through the whole region. Then
yeah.
at that point, um,
The next question is, do we think that the regime will align more with Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, or will it reach out to Saudi Arabia and the West? As we've sort of discussed, and I think Aaron spoke more to it, I think that the natural alignment for Syria would be with the Gulf states, which is Western leaning, but it's not as far in the West camp as, say, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt.
that's right.
Um, The next
To,
question.
one other thing I want to add. I think the one state to really watch in this that is the key conveyor of legitimacy for them and the rest of the region is China. If she wants to pull off a strategic move, obviously he waits for the Gulf to do its backyard stuff, so they get first dibs. But then once that sort of settles down, he jumps in, and that's a game changer at that point, right? Like that's
Yeah.
it, right? Like so and I would expect that they will that people from the HTS or the camps are going to reach out to them. And my secret maybe one, which if the Israelis want to have a backdoor power play in this, will be India. So
Yeah.
there might be some Indo-Pacific great power politics with Syria between India and China. So that
Yeah.
will be my let's put it that way. That's my medium term bet that something interesting happens there.
The next question is, was the Assad regime ever popular with the populace? It's hard to tell, right? Of course, everybody voted in favor for the
99.8% vote. Yeah.
exactly 99 no 99.2%. Don't give him
2%.
more votes than he
Yeah.
deserves. Um,
Almost as high as the conviction rate in Japan was for crime, right?
yeah, I would say that the Assad regime was probably popular with the Alawite community and several other minority communities, and it was popular with the wealthy classes in Damascus. But by and large, the Sunni Arabs were not terribly excited by this government.
Yeah.
Um, there's a question in the chat. Do we know what the future of? Sorry, do we know what the links are between Ahmed al-Shara and Al Qaeda? Ahmed al-Shara started his, I don't know what you want to call it, terrorism career.
Career,
Yeah, exactly. His
his
career in jihadism.
apprenticeship.
Yeah, he was inspired by 9/11, and got involved in a number of Saudi operations. Saudi, as in the ethnic people were Saudi, but it's not run by the Saudi government. Because he grew up in Saudi Arabia. He's ethnically Syrian. His father was born in Syria, moved to Saudi Arabia. He was born in Saudi.
I
Um,
mean, it is
so
if you
so
guys want to believe in conspiracies. So for those of you here that love conspiracies, it totally is. But for those of you that don't, it isn't. Right? That's my little conspiracy
So
joke.
anyway, so they get involved in Iraq. He gets arrested while in Iraq, but he's so good at faking the Iraqi accent that they don't think he's a foreigner. They think he's an Iraqi citizen. They jail him in Iraq. He is released in the late 2000s. He makes his way to Syria. He's jailed pretty early in the Syrian civil war, and he is kept in prison, I think, for about 5 or 6 years. He manages to get released. He joins up with uh, the organization he now runs. Well, actually, it's antecedent organization, Jabhat
Yeah.
al-Nusra, which is
Yeah.
the Syrian version of Al Qaeda. Then they have the rebranding in 2017, I believe, as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. He rises through the organization, and during that period, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is ruling over the city of Idlib and some of the surrounding areas. And so he's involved in the governmental policies of that area, which are Islamist but not extreme. Certainly not the way that Jabhat al-Nusra would have originally ruled it. And
Yeah. I mean, I
that's
think
his
what's
career.
weird about this that's important is that he went through clearly some shift. My guess is in prison, being around other Syrian prisoners, nothing to do that they were Islamist or anything. And I think he took on a more Syrian
Ecumenical.
nationalist, yeah, perspective. Uh, especially relative to when we say, look, at the end of the day, he was not a Zarqawiyist in Iraq. I mean, to me, that's like the
Yeah.
real like red line. I mean, not that Al Qaeda wasn't a red line, of course it was, but there was like gradations, and so and ultimately, uh, and this is, I think, a hard thing for people to understand is that when ISIS developed, there became really this split in the Islamist factions between basically you had to join ISIS or you were just another enemy, and many of those other factions joined up to the coalition to defeat ISIS. And so I think that's something that, and then out of that generated components of this civil war, actually. Like we don't really kind of think about that connective tissue back 13, 14 years ago, 12 to 14 years ago. So, so I think that's where his shift, happened somewhere between those events and his Syrian imprisonment, and then this new generation of what you might call Syrian Islamist. I think that's probably more accurate, actually. And then now he's figuring out how to be I don't know, Syria's JFK or something, right? I mean, just some kind of other thing that they haven't had.
Yeah. The next question, it's actually going to be the last question before I talk about future presentations we might do. Israel bombed Syria many times before the regime change, such as the Iranian embassy. How come Israel had no problem with letting Assad keep its weapons and research facilities? Oh, Israel would have bombed Assad's weapons and research facilities if they knew
They
where
could,
they were,
of
and if they
course.
had permission from the Russians to do that. Remember, Russians
Yep.
controlled Syrian airspace. Now that the Russians don't control Syrian airspace, and
Well,
Syria's
and
airspace
actually, the
is completely
Israelis
open.
did bomb post regime falling continuously in December.
Yeah,
Many target at least dozens of Syrian
right.
targets that
Right,
were,
yeah,
yeah,
the question is though, why didn't they do that like 10 years ago? And it's because A, they didn't know where they were. It's alleged that Assad disclosed the locations of a number of these places to the Israelis when he was on the flight to Moscow. And two, the Russians didn't allow Israel to have free reign to just
that's
bomb
right.
anything in Syria because they wanted to maintain the regime.
That's
So,
right.
um, okay, in terms of future activities, I'm sorry for those of you who on the internet who asked questions, uh, but haven't been uh, that haven't been addressed because there were a lot of great questions on the internet, but I have to go, unfortunately. Um, Upcoming activities. I'm planning to resume my East Asia series sometime in the next few months. I haven't quite gotten the details on that, but I do want to resume that. Um, in ter in terms of other things, we could be convinced to talk about other topics, especially in the Middle East, Europe, where Aaron and I have a bit of expertise. Um,
I do definitely want to do another run at the Ukrainian update, because I think we're sort of due for one in the next few months, I would say.
yeah, especially
Yeah,
when we see what the fallout of Trump's canceling of aid will do.
exactly. And how Europeans respond, all that. So I think that's that. In the next like 2 months, this could be, I think, the Ukrainian update period, and also it looks like the Russians are fairly exhausted in this wave of offensives, and they're going to be, in essence, regenerating for 3 to 6 months. So we might be in a good time in the next, by early March to have a presentation there.
Yeah, Rob,
Yeah.
Zach, do you want to say anything before we sign off?
No, all good. Thank you so much, guys. We might have follow-up amendment presentations soon, depending on Jane. And if Robert wants, I always have this Asian philosophy group going, so we can always expand that and start from the beginning. Asian philosophy, Asian history, from our group in LA. But I don't know how it works with timing. We can always coordinate that. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and see you soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Robert. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Great job. Thank you.
Cheers. Yep. Have a
Cheers.
great weekend.
Likewise.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.